It's not only the inauguration, more or less, of Figur der Kunst, it's also the inauguration of the Schaustelle, and I'm really nearly shocked, surprised. It's a great surprise that so many of you came. Even back. The first thing he wanted to do was to check the screening, and here nothing was finished. I mean, it was really like a Baustelle and changed completely overnight. So congratulations to the organization who really created a great place, and we are very happy to be. Some of you might know already Isaac's work, which was shown in the Brandhorst Museum. Was it last year, Isaac? 10,000 Waves, which is his last work he did in China. We try to present and to combine multi-channel installations and single-channel work from all times of his career. So we have the two multi-channel installations, one in the Götz collection, Phantom Creole, and here around the corner in the Brandhorst, I went there today again, we have Western Union small boats in a very beautiful installation also. And we start tonight with The Attendant and Young Soul Rebels. And because Isaac immediately went here without even seeing his room and was worried so much about the technical conditions, I wanted to ask again a question I asked yesterday already at the press conference. Wouldn't it be much easier if you had stayed a painter as you were before, instead of doing all this technological, highly sophisticated, technical, complicated, and not so easy to present works?
Well, I think that anybody who knows me well knows that I'm not the most technological person. So it was very ironic when I became a media professor at Karlsruhe at HFG, because of, I guess you could say, my lack of technical knowledge. and to that degree, I guess you could say, yes, painting has been sort of a very wonderful existence. But I think one of the things that sort of happened really when I was at art school at St Martin's, which was a long time ago, in the early 80s, is that painting was seen as a kind of not dead art form, because I admired my sort of fellow artist students like Peter Doig, for example, who was a painter. And in fact, I'm actually curating a painting show next month at Victoria Mirror Gallery, which is called Cinematic Visions, but it has nothing to do with cinema. It's a painting show. It's being co-created by myself and James Franco and Glenn Scott Wright, who's a director of Victoria Mirror Gallery. So I do have a strong interest in painting, but I think that cinema is different, and I think that the moving image for me has always been very exciting, maybe more exciting than painting, and I think it's a kind of modern sort of art form. And I've always thought of being myself as someone who is very interested in being modern, if not postmodern, being involved in the technologies, even if I'm not a really technological sort of type of guy, and to basically make work that would somehow try to infuse a certain modernity. So for me, the idea of sort of making films, and for me also the idea of new technologies is very exciting. You know, even if I have lot of problem understanding them. So I think sort of so I guess you could say that I have a pictorial approach in the new technologies, that I want to bring some of the sort of, if you like, dare I say, kind of more old-fashioned preoccupations connected to the fine arts into those new technologies, but also I want to bring certain questions to those technologies which to my mind are not non-neutral, but certainly growing up as I did in London, being born in London, but sort of not always having the sort of images reflected that I wanted to see. I thought I'd better make them myself, rather than, I'm not the complaining type. I don't like complaining about there not being this and that. You make them. And so making them is, and the questions, of course, it began to be developed around kind of post-coloniality, around questions of identity. They all became very central preoccupations as well. And so in some ways they're better subjects for sort of new media moving image works almost than paintings, you could say. So I think that this is what was advised to me by my professor at the time, that you should actually go into the cinema rather than make paintings. And I think he was right, actually. So kind of, so that's why I don't paint now, I guess.
But the piece we show here is Baltimore. In Baltimore, there is this combination of technology, of special effects, but also there is Piero della Francesca, there is inside the Baltimore Museum, there are paintings which are very essential to the film and also to understand the film.
Absolutely.
So painting is very present in a certain way, even if it's not in the foreground of the work.
Because in some ways I think some of the ideas in a work like Baltimore, for example, if you think about the school of Piero della Francesca, we've got the whole idea of perspective and the way that sort of in this moment, it's almost kind of pre-Renaissance, that you've got the perspective becoming very important in painting. And I think one of the things that developed in the new technologies was certainly this question of perspective or vision, the idea of vision being really centrally part of trying to kind of, because I think artists in that particular moment in time in painting were trying to create new images to a certain extent. They're in the business of the language of creating new aesthetic. And so in Baltimore, there's a direct relationship to the use of the free screens in the multiple screen version of this question of perspective and space and thinking about all those things. So in some senses, there are old-fashioned questions, you see. They're in painting, but in the new technologies, at least, we can explore them anew and find interesting new possibilities.
I think, maybe you do not agree, that what you create through the new technologies and by using old formal questions like perspective, you create a sort of new space of perception, visual perception, which you use also to talk about about very contemporary subjects, very political subjects. Would you agree that this new kind of space of perception is something which is proper to your work?
But the thing is, the person that knows about that more than me is Rania Gaffer, who's sitting over there, who works with me at HFG, and she's writing a thesis about my work, and she knows a lot more about these questions than I do, actually. She's the scholar that you need to ask.
But now you have the mic, so you have to say.
But, since you asked me, I think that one of the things around sort of the new technologies and the thing around perception, and one of the things that's been really exciting about showing my work here in Munich at the Brandhaus Museum, especially when we installed 10,000 waves, was the idea of doing this crazy thing of installing 9 screens in a space, and the whole idea of trying to create a new spectatorship in the gallery space, the mobile spectator. I've been working on this idea of trying to sort of create a way of a new way of looking at moving images, and so that the spectator becomes part of the sort of choreography, part of the work almost. And so all of these things you can work with and play with in the museum and gallery art context in a way that in the film context you can't, because of course the film context is ablaze with 3D, but 3D is not really new, but we know that as the technologies develop, there's this whole thing around this miraculum of the real and sort of the whole idea of the haptic and kind of almost touching gazes. But I think there's a way in which, at least in the art context, or at least what I try to do in it, is to play with vision and to, in terms of perception, to have a heightened sense of perception, and then at the same time try to draw audiences to questions which might be a bit difficult, but then at the same time they might not experience in the same sort of way, you know. So there's a special thing, I think, that you can do in the art context, which I sort of treasure.
You said before that you started to do your filmic work and your studies in a sort of a period of postmodernism, but isn't that a contradiction when you say now that you try to find new ways, new languages, and new ways of perception, which is not at all a postmodern concept. It's much more like an avant-garde concept, because you're looking for something new which hasn't been there and which is different from what is there.
Yes, that's right, because I think I'm a die-hard avant-gardist, I guess. But I think also kind of, it's something around the idea of also trying to, you know, if you grow up where you have images which are not really of yourself, so to speak, then in a way you don't have to care for the rules of representation. You can break the rules. So I like the idea of breaking the rules of representation and trying to create a kind of different sort of a nude relationship. But I also realize that you're absolutely right, that some of these are old-fashioned questions. You know, the pictorial question, for example, is old-fashioned to a certain extent. The question around aesthetics is, you know, of course, a very German question, in fact, and I think that's also one of the reasons why my work has had a certain reception here as well. And, you know, because in England, they don't really like too many new ideas, you know, and they don't like, you know, I mean, it's into contemporary art, but it's not really into contemporary art in a German sense, you know. They like it in England because of the YBAs, and it made money, you know, so the whole relationship between the art world and money, and that being a bit sexy, and, you know, Nicholas Rota building a huge Tate Modern II, and all of that stuff. But I think sort of the kind of deeper understanding or deeper relationship that you might have in this culture is, you know, something which I think to be admired. And I think, of course, Munich is a sort of centre, isn't it? You know, with Gert's collection, with Brandhorst, you've got Ari, you know, the Alexa camera, which I'm shooting my new work on. You know, this is all from Munich, you know, and the relationship to technologies, which is sort of in this town, right? So, yeah.
Talking about this critical opinion you have about England, when you did a film like Young Soul Rebels, you referred pretty much to Thatcherism, the 80s, but also even earlier, and to minorities inside England, to a, let's say, contemporary reality, which was very political. How important is this political subtext?
Well, I mean, the thing about Young Soul Rebels is that, you know, when I sort of started at art school in 1980, which dates me, basically kind of, that was the eve of Thatcherism. And we had Thatcherism for, you know, it felt like for 20 years, you know, so it was a pretty powerful force. And so that does really kind of mark one in a particular way. And of course, with Thatcher's funeral, you know, I'm sure you've seen that in the press. I mean, you know, it's very controversial and contradictory, and, you know, of course she's seen as a revolutionary of some kind. But she certainly did produce a revolutionary spirit at the time when I was growing up. And I guess I can confess my other German connection, because little known to me, one of the people who introduced me to sort of making work was someone who was involved in the Baader Meinhof gang, and they lived out in secret in the East End. So Astrid Prohl was actually one of the people who sort of introduced me to new technologies and to photography and to film. So I have this very sort of...
How did that happen? What was she doing? Was he
Because
she undercovering?
where I grew up in the East End of London, you had lots of counterculture groups. And one of the people that I met when I was very young were a group of filmmakers who were involved in trying to make political films. And I guess my political formation has grown out of that. It's grown out of this conversation with 70s counterculture, the kind of counterculture that grew up against sort of Thatcherism and all those ideals. And so, in a way, Youngster Rebels, set in 1976, 77, the Queen's Silver Jubilee, punk rock, and all of that. I mean, it was kind of de rigueur, you know. The Sex Pistols were sort of number one with God Save the Queen. There was a kind of radicalism. And so, in a way, kind of, I think, making that film in the early 90s was to try to say that, well, this was important formation, and that some of the things that we were trying to say and make at that particular moment was sort of what felt important. And so I was trying to relate that in the film. And we were very inspired by different films which had been made by Hanif Qureshi and Stephen Frears. And it was my attempt at trying to mainstream some of those ideas. It didn't last very long because I wasn't a fan of sort of narrative films or working in that industry. I could be re-interested in it, but I think, you know, I'm having too much fun in the art context. So yeah.
Yeah, and let's also say that you changed and innovated a lot of the narration. You never left, in my opinion, narration, but you changed the narrational language of conventional cinema, going away from this more mainstream cinema.
Yes, because I think mainstream cinema is boring. I don't know what you think, but yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, the possibility for cinema is so exciting that we could have a really vibrant sort of cinema culture, and of course one did also exist in Germany as well. I used to go to the Berlin Film Festival every year that fell in the 80s and 90s. But I think it slipped and shifted. I think kind of new technologies, how we watch films, how we sort of watch them on our computers, all of that. I think all of that shifted our tastes and expectations. And yeah, so I think we're in a pretty different spot today. So yeah.
I think we are in a much more hybrid spot also, because there are more influences from more technological new media, and also from another way of thinking, because the ideologies are not what they used to be like 20 years ago. So it's you are working with all this in your films, which is they have a very what about literature in your films? Because I know that you read a lot of books, and the books are very important, even if they don't appear in the films, like in Fantôme Créolia or in Frantz Fanon, even more evident. There is a lot of background, literary background there, and research.
Yes, I like the idea of doing lots of research, and that's a kind of habit which developed when I started making films in the early 80s, where I got funded by Channel 4 Television, and we could be commissioned to make a work, but we could take 3 years to make that work. It was a very special scenario, and Adam Fountain and the kind of workshop film collectives at that time, the ACTT, the Film Union, British Film Institute, all gathered around, and we created this kind of culture policy where we could work under the auspices of the ACTT workshop declaration, and that allowed us to research and make projects for quite a long time before they would air on television or be shown. And so I've tried to import that practice. But the thing is, I don't really like talking so much about it. I like the idea of doing lots of research and then covering it all up, and nobody knows about it. Then you can just look at the works for themselves, if you see what I mean. Yeah.
In the work, in the realization of the work, but also in the research for the works, is there still an important spirit of collective? Are you working with a whole group? Are you working always with the same technicians and researchers? Or is it more Isaac himself who's digging into things?
Well, you wouldn't see a single thing if it was just me. You know, that all the work that I make is always connected to collaborations of sorts. Cinematographer, photographers, sound design, editor, all of these aspects are very, very important. You could say that when you're working that you have to cast for these things, that all the people, just like if you were in a film and you cast actors, that they have to be right for the part. There's never a bad actor, there's just a bad choice. You know, the director got the choice wrong. So I think sort of the question of the spirit of collaboration and the spirit of, because, you know, whether all films are too complicated just to make by yourself. Some people who are very technological, unlike myself, they could shoot it, you know, they could edit it. And in fact, when I first started making works, I did do all those things myself. Like a film like Territories, I shot some of it, I edited the film, I did the sound design. And all of those things are very important. It's good to know all the various aspects of making a work. But then you just know that it's always better to work with people who are much better than yourself at the various aspects.
But my question was also whether there is a whole, let's say, family which you are faithful to, because I remember when I went to the editing room in London, your editor, you had been working a lot with him on several films. Or today I saw again Western Union and the choreographer Russell Mulliphant, and you did several films with him. The same with your camera operator, the DOP, which was very important, which is in several films, or your actress. At least 3 or 4 times you worked with Mary, I think. No?
Yes, absolutely, and in a way, I mean, also there are divorces as well. And you know, I could say that sort of, for example, working with Russell Mulliphant, who's an amazing choreographer, that you know, that when I made Western Union Small Boats, I thought, okay, that's it, I'm never going to work with another dancer choreographer again. Because that work was such a difficult work to make. It was difficult to work with a choreographer and to do in the subject matter, and then to choreograph these movements in an actual architectural space. You're not in a theatre or a dance space, all of those things. It was difficult, it was physically difficult and demanding. And of course that makes for grumpiness. And also when we made that project, for example, and projected it in the theatre, it was also difficult because of the dichotomy between, say, the dance world and the art world. So, but I would say that sort of some of the collaborations, like Vanessa Myrie, for example, who is in Phantom Creole, Jenny Gert's collection, also in Western Union Small Boats. I mean, I see her as a kind of collaborator of sorts. And in her character, I want to create a trans-textual quality to her kind of persona. And each film hopefully builds a persona, because it's a counter kind of, if you like, strategy to the kind of more Hollywood strategy where you work with a star, because these are not stars, they're friends and colleagues. And so, and again, in terms of someone like Adam Finch, who's edited all of our multiple screen works, he is a filmmaker in his own right, and he did the same course as I did at St Martin's School of Art, which was an experimental structured film course. We had these very strict structured filmmakers, and we didn't agree with them, but we learnt a lot from them. And I think in our arguments, in a sense, we still want to bring some of that in the works, and he secretly knows all the things that I would like, and we share the same language almost. So all of these things are very important in these various collaborations.
Let's talk about some of the leitmotifs which are there all the time, which come back, will come back in the next piece you're doing at the moment. One of those leitmotifs is migration. What is your own background? You were born in England, but your parents come from the Caribbean?
That's right. You know, I do realise sometimes when I'm in Germany, some people might say to me, "Oh well, well, people can say where you're from all the time." You know, I mean, I know that in Germany it's very different. You see, in England, if you're born in a country, then you have that identity and nationality. You know, you're British, or I could say that you're English. You know, I could say I'm very English actually. So kind of. You know, that doesn't quite work out in Germany. I'm not quite sure why it doesn't, for the people who may not have, as it were, the kind of same kind of white background. But certainly I think the whole thing about people like myself, and I guess I'm going to put Steve McQueen in this category as well, is that we both want to kind of acknowledge that we have this different background, and at the same time, we want people to forget it. Do you see what I mean? In the sense that I think it's important in terms of the works, because the funny thing is that when I was making works like Young Sir Rebels or Frantz Fanon, it seems very important that these questions of cultural difference are debated and spoken about. But then I also want there to be a certain taken for grantedness of those questions, if you see what I mean. And I think in some aspects, you know, in England, that's been achieved, you know. So then it's not unusual, you know, that you would have like a black person make a film or be an artist or, you know, say whatever they like, you know. And of course, in someone like, you know, like Steve McQueen, I mean, he made a film about Bobby Sands, and why not? You know, so I think it's just that kind of taken for grantedness of being able to do whatever you like, whenever you like. And at the same time, if you want to push certain questions, that you can push those questions too. And I think that kind of dual approach is kind of important in a way, and it's a way of recognising sort of what's new in Europe and also kind of what's part of a history. I mean, of course, the different countries have different histories, you know, and sort of, in my case, you know, my parents who come from the Caribbean, a small island called St. Lucia has a very well-known poet called Derek Walcott, and I collaborated with him on a project called Paradise Amoros, which was in Ocri Mesa's documentar 11, of course. You know, Ocri's around the corner now, so another reason why I mean it's very exciting. I think there's a way in which certainly sort of, you could say that some of the works that I've made, I work like 10,000 Waves, is totally influenced by the fact that my parents came from elsewhere, so to speak, you know, and so whether that elsewhere is China, then, you know, I'm sort of interested. But for example, in my new project, I'm very interested in also another movement, and that's a movement of capital. You know, so that I think, so it's interesting how the different linkages get made. You know, there's interest in the movement of people, bodies, perhaps being in places that people think they might not, they shouldn't be, etc., etc. But that's happening all the time. That's been in the 21st century. We have new technologies. New technologies, they disregard distance, but, you know, in that sense, it seemed to me logical that bodies would follow, and that's where it becomes a bit more controversial. But all of this stuff is happening because it seems to me that people are following capital. So I think that's where I am at the moment.
Because in works like Paradise Omeros, the migration idea is much more a cultural migration, or the culture as the rest of the migration, or a phenomenon which is the visible part of the migration. Now it's becoming more and more, not just the capital, but it started with the economical migration, which started in 10,000 Waves, as much as in the film Western Union, where it's about the African migration to Sicily and Lampedusa.
Well, because in a way, my argument really in a work like, say, Western Union Small Boats is that the Mediterranean is a very kind of porous region that we kind of have had, like Ottoman Empire and all of that stuff has been happening there for a very long time. The food, it's an Italian food, Sicilian, fantastic Sicilian food. You know, it's just all there. You know, it's there in the culture, so to speak. But I think sort of one of the other things really kind of in the works is really just trying to sort of look at this sort of culture difference and saying, well, yes, it can be an art form, it can be something that can be profound, but also we can take that profoundness or take some of those questions for granted now, I think, as well. If you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so.
But this cultural past very often is represented by cinema in your work. Not only by literature, as you said, the literature is not the visible part of the work, but cinema, it's in Western Union, it's the place where the Visconti movie was shot. In Photon Creole, it's South Africa, it's Burkina Faso and the Ouagadougou Festival. So cinema is something which is very present from the very beginning in a certain way.
No, absolutely, because I think the theme of cinema, whether it's you know, the representation of Palazzo Gangi, where Visconti shot Leopard, which is in Western Union small boats, because the other thing about that work, it's also about sort of miming all the spaces where Visconti shot the leopard. So instead of the ballroom dance, you have this rather modern choreography by Russell Elephant taking place on the ballroom dance floor where Visconti shot the leopard. Or if we think about Phantom Creole, then it's the fact that Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso has this fantastic festival that's been running for 30 years. It's a rather francophone affair. It's a French West African film festival, but it is the kind of African Cannes film festival. And it's been running for 30 years, and it's the poorest country in the world, but then they have this film festival that they've been doing quite rigorously and dedicatedly. And so you see all the cinema spaces in the Phantom Creole work, and there's references to film and references to people like the French surrealists, Andrew Gide, and sort of friends going to West Africa, and that whole kind of, if you like, surrealist ethnography that came out of the conversation between that and African culture. So all of those things I'm trying to explore in the Phantom Creole piece, as well as contrasts with the representation of the Arctic North and the story of Matthew Henson, the black explorer who went to the North Pole. So I think there's these aspects which I'm sort of playing around with in that work.
In Baltimore, the piece which is shown here, it is more the history of black cinema and blaxploitation, so from the 70s. And there is Van Peebles, who is, of course, the protagonist of the film himself. What is for you the dimension, the popular dimension of this black cinema? And are you, when you dig into it, because you made a documentary also about the badass and
well, I can say that a lot of my work sometimes develops from teaching, and at the time in the sort of early 2000s, I was teaching at Harvard University a course on video art and a course on sort of black cinema. And I realized, of course, I'm teaching Americans. I decided to teach a course called Blaxploitation Cinema to Quentin Tarantino. And I did that in a rather provocative way, because in a way, I think the black sort of exploitation films are the bête noire of my own practice. In other words, you know, I've never dreamt of making the kind of blaxploitation type film. Could have been very commercially. I mean, they make them in London now, in England all the time. The sort of gangster movies. They're the kind of films that get made. But certainly, this kind of new genre became very fascinating in my research and teaching, which resulted in a collaboration with Colin McCabe, who had a company, Minerva Pictures, that were doing these genre films or genre documentaries, and I made the Bad Art Cinema documentary, which looked at, blaxploitation cinema to Quentin Tarantino. We interviewed Samuel L. Jackson and Quentin Tarantino and Pam Grier and all those types. And Baltimore is the kind of antithetical result to making that work, because Melvin Van Peebles, who I met, who made this kind of rather bonkers film called Sweet Sweet Back's Badass Song, he was very intriguing, and I felt like it would be great to make a waxwork out of him after I went to the Great Blacks in Wax Museum, which really does exist in Baltimore.
But is there really his wax figure is in the museum, or you created it for the film?
No, I made the waxwork of Melvin Van Peebles for the film, and then subsequently I gave the waxwork to Melvin, and that's in the Studio Museum collection in New York, which is great. But I think one of the main things which developed from making those works was just this idea of exploring American culture, which I've done a lot in lots of different works. And even a work like Young to Rebels, a feature film, is very much looking at the influence of American culture and black music on the kind of, on my teenage years.
Is there a big aesthetical difference in style, in language, between your documentaries, the multi-channel works, and your movies?
Well, I like to think that there isn't, but I think in a work like, for example, Frantz Fanon, Black Skins, White Masks, probably there are some similarities between that work and a work like Western Small Boats, in the sense that there's reconstruction, there's use of image. But in the documentary works, or the film essay works, I like the idea of exploring certain themes, and I like the idea of the documentary as a kind of artistic or poetic form. And so whether it's the portrait of Derek Jarman, which I collaborated with Tilda Swinton, or whether it's Frantz Fanon, or whether it's looking at the history of black Hollywood in the 70s, then all of those things are better explored in the documentary almost, because of the question of time, information, and these sorts of aspects.
In your art pieces, in your multi-channel pieces, very often you have been criticized for being too beautiful in form, too beautiful in your language, too beautiful in your images. Does that,
That's
for
right.
a long time there was this, there are some prejudices in art. You cannot be too beautiful, you cannot be too funny. It's not good to laugh too much, and the art world is serious.
That's
the
right.
same when you're talking about migration, politics, poor people, you cannot do it in a very beautiful, very ethical way. Did that hurt you?
Well, no, I think it just depends on who's making the work, and, I think that's the difference. And also I think it's kind of about the relationship to having a feeling about it, because what tends to happen, I think, sometimes in an art context is that you find an interesting subject and you think, wow, let me do that subject. But how you do it has a certain distance. But I don't have that distance if I'm making a project. I usually want to have a real close proximity to it. And then I want the audience to have a close proximity to it. And the way that I make the close proximity to it is through how it's being shot, how it's being lit, how it's being choreographed, the sound, all of those things. I want to use all the apparatus, all the devices, you could say, of the cinematic, of cinema, or of the moving image, of sound and image, to communicate that. Well, because I feel passionate about it, I guess. So I think it's that relationship that's really important. And sometimes I think it's a bit missing, because I think, in the art context we want to be a bit cool, a bit distant, with viewing here and all of that stuff. So I'm not that kind of guy. So I think in a way, for me, it's important to have a kind of proximity to something that gives it a certain, not just kind of information or a correct way of presenting something, but something where you have also a connection to it, a feeling, all of those things. So I'm not saying that, the other approaches are not good as well. I think they're very important, but
Because beauty is not only for communication, beauty is also for seduction. Your films are very seductive. The public is
yes,
attracted by the beauty of the images. So you use it a little bit like a tool also.
it is like a tool, yes, because I want people to be drawn to a subject matter that they may not want to be drawn to. So that's one strategy. But then, well, you could say people do that in advertising as well. They do. Probably people should be a little bit on their toes if they're looking at my work. you know, because there's a way in which I don't want to trap people, but I certainly want to draw them. But hopefully there's a way of still having a certain criticality. And it's because we don't usually associate certain questions. Being critical means really that it should, you know, this is an ugly subject. It should look ugly. You know, all those people coming over, you know, it's not very nice. So we should, you know, make sure it's a bit dowdy and, you know, then we'll feel like care about watching it. So I think there's a lot of that going on as well.
Also, I think it's very important because like this, it stays completely open. Because if it was as ugly as a subject, so to say, it wouldn't be open, there would be a message. In your works, there is no message. There are questions, there are subjects, there are problems which are evoked. But there is never an open message, an open communicated message of what to think.
Hopefully not. I mean, I want the audience to think for themselves. So, and that's the thing around the moving image, and the problem with it is that, you know, that we're sort of entertained most of the time, and it's a tricky one. So, on one level, I think there's right to be a criticality around it, and on the other, I think it's also good to question things when they become orthodoxies.
So a tricky question, are your works entertaining?
Well, sometimes, yes. I hope so.
If I propose to you for next year the new James Bond, you would agree and accept?
Very interesting. I have to say, what I did like about the new James Bond, and remember we went to see it in Karlsruhe, is that I love how it was shot, Roger Deakins. And in fact, I went to Ari yesterday, and of course it was shot on the new Alexa camera. Very interesting.
Now we know whether you can.
So kind of there's a way in which sort of, you know, yeah, Roger Deakins is an amazing photographer, but the Alexa camera is obviously very good.
So you're much more interested in technology than you said at the beginning, you know.
That could be true.
You didn't answer my question for the James Bond. You said, so if you can shoot it on the Alexa, it would be yes.
But the thing is that I did like that James Bond movie. But you know, with James Bond, it's kind of, I mean, the last James Bond movie was, I think it's hilarious to look at that James Bond. But I think, I thought the last James Bond movie was great, as those types of movies go.
You once said that one of the problems of being a filmmaker and an artist in Great Britain is that the British cinema is much too close to the American Hollywood industry, so it's really an industrial cinema. And you think that's more the case than, for instance, in Germany you don't have Hollywood, but you have television, which influences very much the aesthetics of cinema. So these dangers are everywhere, not only in Great Britain.
No, I think, you know, in France it's very cineastic, but then, you know, in France, well, when I walk around in Paris, I think there's another cinema that I don't see that could be there in French culture. And I think, you know, in Britain, of course, the kind of sister culture of American culture in terms of language means that there's a kind of pretending of emulating sort of Americanness, and there is a certain go-between in terms of, I mean, you have to see the BAFTA awards and what they're like. I would say that British cinema is sort of in trouble. It's been in trouble for quite a long time. Recently, the government cut it drastically, its budget. There was an interesting period that was happening in the Film Council, where you got Gillian Waring, you know, her feature film got made, Tracy Emin, Steve McQueen, several artists were making features. So that was a very interesting period. That's gone at the moment, even though it's gone to the British Film Institute. but the British Film Institute is now in the business of renouncing its history and its very important cinema legacy. So it's very ambivalent. And of course, yes, in German culture, well, in Bavaria, I think of Fassbinder and all the work that he made here in Munich in his early works. And, you know, there is that kind of relationship to television, which there is in Britain as well. So all these places where you have this sort of these different contaminations of what cinema could be and what the moving image is. And I think, for me, obviously, where you can stay more faithful to it is in an art context, but that doesn't always have to be the case. Yeah.
Two last questions before we open up. First question, Derek. Derek is exceptional in the films which you did. What is the, in relation to what you just said about the British film industry, Derek Jarman, what does he symbolize? What is he standing for? Because he worked with mainstream cinema to make money with his decor, and also he did his very special, singular artistic work. What is Derek about? What is your film about? How did you know Jarman well? Did you know him? How did you work with Tilda Swinton?
Well, I think the reason why Derek came about was really because Colin McCabe, who's been my producer for several films, kept bothering me, you know, and said, here is a script of an interview with Derek, it's 12 hours long, I want you to look at it, we can make a documentary. And I said to him, you've got to be joking, you know, it's not going to work. Derek just talking and talking, it's going to bore everybody to death. And, you know, forget it. But he kept bothering me, you know, and so basically I thought, well, I better look at this interview. So I looked at the interview and I thought, oh my God, it's quite astonishing. It's an astonishing interview. And I think one of the other things that was happening at this time, that Tilda Swinton, it was before Tilda Swinton became the more kind of who Tilda is today, gave a speech at the Edinburgh Film Festival, and it was in remembrance of Derek, because a lot of people felt that, I think, well, I certainly did, and I think other people shared this with me, that in 1994, when Derek Jarman died, in a way a lot of independent British cinema died, and part of the art world did as well. And I think, really, I can cast my mind back to being in Berlin Film Festival in 1994, and you know, this kind of occasion, and literally leaving the Berlin Film Festival and going to New York, and I lived really in New York between 94 to about the 2000. And because we didn't want to live in England, because England was such a difficult place, really. And I think when Tilda gave her speech in Edinburgh, it was sort of maybe 10 years after Derek's death, but basically it was a very passionate speech about Derek. And the kind of cinema that he represented, and that has been lost. And so I think Colin, who had been head of the British Film Institute film production for several years, his bothering me sort of made a bit of sense. And then when I thought about combining Tilda's speech as a kind of narration to go throughout the work, then I became hooked. And then I started looking at Derek Jarman's Super 8 films, and I thought, these are amazing. In fact, his Super 8 films are far more interesting maybe than his feature films. And so I started to get very excited about this, and approached Serpentine Gallery, spoke to Hans-Ulrich Obrist and said, I would like to do an exhibition of Derek's Super 8 films. And the fantastic thing that happened around this was that there's a fantastic patron of the arts, Maya Hoffman, who basically bought the Derek Jarman Super 8 collection for like 1.4 million, and has done this amazing conservation job. And all of the 78 Super 8 films that he made are going to be released at her new place in Arles quite soon. So all of these things came out of this idea of trying to revive Derek's work and the memory of independent cinema, and also to try to connect his work to a younger generation who might not know of him. Because when I spoke to my students who, Derek Jarman, they would say, well, Derek who? So kind of it seemed to me that that was important to try to connect like this sort of cinema to a younger generation. So, yeah.
Last question. The work you're shooting at the moment, you went to Iceland, I think, last week. You already said it's about capital and about how capital is moving, the migration of money in our days, so to say. What is it about, more precisely?
Well, it's quite hard to say what it's about, but it has 5 or 6 characters, a gallerist, a hedge fund manager, art consultant, and also an artist. And one story is in Reykjavik, 2008, the crash, and focuses on an artist who was building this amazing house, and then he lost the house and lost his studio. And so really it's about the turmoil which happens to this person. What happens when capital is halted, when the flow is stopped? What happens to people? And so, in a way, I guess I'm making it because I'm terrified that it's just going to happen to me. Or it's going to happen to all of us, I don't know. So I think there's, so that story is shot in Iceland, and I was looking and casting for the person, I found them. And I'm very excited about it.
But is it because it sounds like with 5 or 6 protagonists, will there be dialogue?
There's lots of dialogue.
Because your last
really unusual.
Completely without. Yeah, it's very unusual.
Yeah, scary.
Okay, are there any questions, scary questions, or not so scary questions to Isaac?
Yeah, I have a question relating to the film image being passing more and more through the internet and being watched on all kinds of other devices than really being seen on the big screen. What do you think is happening to the way of narrating stories in film in relation with this movement of film images going through the internet?
Scary question.
Yeah. See, the thing is, people on the internet, to my mind, they watch them on their computer, and usually it's like a bad Hollywood film or something. But I don't really see what the innovation is on the internet with images, or how I can see how time is getting consumed. I like to use this term called the distracted spectator, that I think through new technologies there's a distraction. You could be at an art gallery, but you're going to be on your mobile phone. You could be in the cinema, but you could be also speaking on the mobile phone as well. So I think there's a way that technology has ripped out the kind of contract between how you look at images, for example. So I think that's happened. But in terms of is there a radical aesthetic change? I mean, in some works I can see that there's the use of the internet, and indeed in Higher FG, where I teach, there are lots of people who make works, or claim to make works of art that sort of somehow could be radical or different because of new technologies. But in my mind, even if I'm very happy to be working with new technologies, I also want to be quite critical of new technologies as well, because I don't think new technologies just produce a revolution. They can also be quite reactionary as well, I think. So I think some of that kind of reactionary aspect has developed as well. And so I think, I don't know if that's like a conservatism, but I think it's that time has been robbed, concentration's been robbed, time's been speeded up. But is it good, is it bad? I don't know. It's what it is, I think, right? So,
I think we hear the painter a little bit who's speaking, no?
pardon?
The painter,
The painter.
who is speaking.
Well, I like the idea of slowing things down a bit. Yeah, so I think if you go into the context here, or you see an installation, you can't just walk past it like a painting, you know, you have to spend time. So I think there's that aspect, you know. So I think there is that thing that's been happening on the flip side. Trying to break down the viewing relations. So,
Any other questions there?
I saw in your installation over at the Brandhorst, which I really loved. I thought it was very fascinating. Now, I'm into filmmaking myself, and I always had in mind to do a project with multi-screens. Now, I'm a little bit more into storytelling than you are, and
that's good.
But on the other hand, what always kind of held me back was the marketability. I mean, this is a museum and it's an installation. I mean, would you need a traveling circus or something with a project like that? I mean, like you couldn't go into cinemas anymore, or you would have to be in a black box in the foyer or something like that. I mean, have you ever thought of any possibilities to get around that?
No, I think the travelling circus is a good one, you know, because you have to have a lot of people who install the work, and you know, there's a lot of commitment. You know, I think that Udo Brandhorst had to buy quite a few projectors, which he didn't like. So I hear. But
well, I mean, they go down in price all the time, so
that's a good thing that they do. But they have very good projectors in the Brandhorst, I must say.
No, I mean, really, it's most about most about, you know, getting a space and kind of getting the attention. I mean, the marketing of cinema, that's an established thing. The marketing of museums is established as well. But I mean, like with something, a movie like that, free floating would be probably very hard to market.
I know, but you see, that's my problem with film, per se, because it's the whole idea that the question of the market becomes before the idea, almost, you know? So I think that's where it's really back to front. And so I think sort of, I have to believe in the idea, you know, the idea is the paramount thing, and the rest has to follow, really. So, but you're right, I mean, it is, you know, difficult, you know, and, you know, it's nebulous and it's not sort of defined, really, but that's...
Which makes it all the more interesting.
Which yeah, it makes it more interesting.
I also think, is it not true that you get freer because you are not so much in the market, because you're not obliged to think of making the money back on at the cinema, at the movie theater, because there is no secondary market for artists' films yet. So art, which is getting more and more a market like cinema also. I mean, we are consuming artworks like we are consuming popcorn. So don't you think it's a chance that this market situation is so different, that it is still more difficult maybe, and that there is no traveling circuit, but there's a certain freedom to that also? Or am I too optimistic?
No, I think there is. I think sort of it's about the kind of creative autonomy, and even people who work in an art context and work in a cinema context now all say that they will continue to work in an art context. You know, so I think that's interesting as well, because, you know, there's a way in which sort of maybe you don't have to choose necessarily as well. You know, it doesn't have to be either or. You can do both, even if one wants. But I do think there's an autonomy that I sort of treasure in being able to make things in an art context where the work of art becomes the thing that's the more important aspect of it, rather than, you know, the whole analogy with, you know, bums on seats, which is really so much of what, well, it's not even bums on seats now, is it? It's really to do with the sort of internet, really, and, you know,
it's another market, which is
it's another market, yes.
More questions,
Yes.
please.
Hi. I would like to go to a point when you said that although this theme is too ugly, but you look at it, you must look at it in a beautiful way. How do you find?
You don't have to do it in a beautiful way.
Okay. How do you find the confrontation zwischen Authenticity und Artificiality? That's my question.
But that's a very interesting question, because, you know, in my school of thought, I think that all images are constructed, even if they pretend to not be. You know, if they're a documentary, if it's a kind of a reportage.
No, but in connection to the essence from this thing, or the essence of this, from this image, to put it that way, not necessarily in a reportage or documentary way, but in connection with the truth from this image. That's the thing.
The truth of the image.
Yeah, you know.
I don't think I believe in the truth of the image. No. I mean, I think there's always a question of being lexical. You know, there was something that was there, you know, there's a time aspect, you know, there's an experience. There can be, not to be too theoretical, there can be the Foucauldian idea of the regime of truth, you know, of the experience, you know, and that can be in place and is important. But truth in images, a suspect, I think.
But the truth in art?
Truth in art.
Heidegger idea of the truth in art, or art as a place, or a, what do you say, Lichtung in English, for truth, because even if you say every artwork is artificial, every image, but yes, it reveals the truth, or does it not?
Well, a certain truth. I don't like the idea of fixing things. Do you see what I mean? You know.
I'm not saying truth in the sense of reality, not at all.
No, I know. But I think there's, yeah, I mean, it's just like, well, I understand there's a certain German philosophical tradition around these sorts of debates. And I guess you could say that there's another tradition that I'm sort of always looking at or thinking about, you know, which comes from the sort of cultural studies, it comes from people who I've worked with closely, like Stuart Hall, you know, and it has slightly different perspectives around these sorts of questions, you know, but certainly, I guess it's true to say that, since we're talking about truth, that it's true to say that the reason why one might work in an art context is that I feel that maybe that can be a truer context for the things that I want to express than in the kind of cinema per se context, certainly.
One more question. Hi, Isaac. I would like to know, once you finish a project, do you keep watching your work, or do you? And if you keep watching it once it's finished, do you wish, or do you sometimes even go back and change things?
Well, I'd love to do a Young Rebels remix, but I don't own that work, so I can't do it. You know, so kind of yeah, because there's certain types of things you look at that, you think that was really dumb, or kind of like, you know, I'd like to read, you know, so there's lots of aspects, yeah, I mean, you know, but also sometimes, I mean, when you're installing works, they're always quite different, you know, and I think one of the things, for example, in a work like 10,000 Ways, you wanted that work to be installed differently wherever it's installed, you know, you want to repeat it, and that's, you know, been quite fun to do that. And of course there's some works that you never want to see. You know, you've made them and you don't want to see them, you don't want to view them.
But you will introduce to Young Soul Rebels.
I will?
You have to, you promise. You can say that you don't want to see it again, but
Full exposure about it.
anyway. One or two more questions, please.
I would like to come back to the question where to show the films. You talked about the context of cinema and the context of black box in museums. What can you tell something about to show films in public spaces?
Yes. I think so. I mean, it's very interesting, that question, because recently in Paris, as part of Nuit Blanche, I showed the single screen version of Western Union Small Boats. And in Nuit Blanche, sort of every year in Paris, they have this 24-hour visual arts festival, and where the city is open and people get access into all these wonderful locations where you can see works of art. And I had access in Hotel de Ville, and so I think maybe over sort of 25,000 people saw that work over the space of 24 hours, and it was a large projection. And then I thought, oh God, this is like doing public art, or it felt like it, you know, where people came in a little bit like en masse and saw the work, and it was great. It was a little bit like cinema, you could say. So it's quite exciting to, well, have access to an audience of that scale, and then people could just see the work for free, you know, and just see it projected in this situ, in this rather unique location. So that was exciting, I think. But that's just an example, I would say, of feeling that was a version of doing a sort of public art type event in the context of what I do.
I saw the event and I thought it was also not only like public cinema, it was like a mural, because it was projected, screened on the Hotel de Ville, on the Mairie in Paris, and it was like a mural because you could go by, you could see it. It was more, you could stay and watch it, but it was like painted on the wall.
Yes, and it had this presence, and you did have this contact with the public, you know. So I do think that is, of course, one of the utopian ideas of making sort of cinema, that you have this relationship to the public. And whenever I go to the National Film Theatre, for example, or people who work with me in my studio, the younger people, there's a kind of return a little bit back to the cinema. Like, they like going to the cinema and seeing these films, Pasolini series, and there's a kind of revival, you could almost say, and that idea of viewing things in a public sense. I have to say that in my sort of maturing years, that I find it claustrophobic these days going to the cinema, you know. I don't want to be next to everybody, and you know, I don't know, maybe I've been in the gallery for too long, it's time to get out, right? Yeah.
But also I think a cinema is a semi-public place, so you know that there is a neighbor, but you like very much that you don't feel him, you don't hear him, he's not eating popcorn or drinking beer or whatever. So it's a very special situation.
Mm.
It's not a claustrophobic situation, because it's assuring that he's there, it's good, and at the same time you don't hear or see him. No? Don't you think so?
Well, I like changing all of that, and that's why I like doing installation work. So I like the idea that sort of in a work like 10,000 Waves, that you're part of the work, you can see people looking at it, and all of this aspect, and changing those kinds of conditions, if you like. But each condition is a good one, you know, not one is better than the other. I just like the idea of playing with those things.
I remember the installation here of 10,000 Waves also was playing with the frustration of not being able to see everything. So you had to move around, but you always missed one or two of the 9 screens.
Yes.
So the mobility also was like a recomposing of the film through the eyes of the spectator.
Yes. Because when I sort of had this experiment with Christine Vanache at the Pompidou, and we did a work called Phantom Creole, which you can see at Ginny Gertz. When we first installed that work, we installed it as sort of 4 diagonal screens, and that we pushed all of the seats, like these cubes, into the center. And we thought, great, okay, now we're trying to conduct a new way of viewing. And then everybody got all their cubes and moved them to the space where they could see all the screens all at once. So it was a great example of how that idea sort of failed to a certain extent. So that's why we now install that work at the Gertz collection, a sort of curve, because in a way the public won on that one. So that's why now, if I make a work, I want to play with this idea of, creating this oscillation. But I could very well go back to making a single screen work as well. So they're just experiments, really.
One more question. If not, we will slowly say the end. At 8 o'clock, Isaac will be there to present his favorite film, Young Soul Rebels. And I thank you very, very much for your patience and for your interest. Thank you, and thank you very much.